Hello and welcome to another tutorial on Ultraschall 5. My name is Joram. Today I want to show you how you can turn an audio recording into a podcast by adding rich metadata. This can be chapter marks and chapter art and also additional metadata that will enrich your podcast. Rich metadata is really important to me for podcasting because it gives you the option to add chapter markers, for example, individual cover images, and also more information about the podcast episode itself so that it looks the best in all podcast clients and your listeners have a chance to consume it at their own the way they want to, essentially by being able to skip around using the chapter marks or to know beforehand what's going to happen in the episode. So how do you add chapter marks? It's really simple. You just use the key M and you create a chapter mark at the position where your cursor is right now. Let me just introduce two chapter marks here, and then you can move them around, adjust where they sit exactly, and then leave them there. The important thing about chapter marks is that you have to set one at the very beginning at the position 0. Otherwise, some podcast clients might not interpret these chapter marks properly, and then you run into all kinds of problems in the display of them, and people will be annoyed at you. So the best way to avoid that is by setting one at the 0 position. If you open the region/marker manager down here in the bottom, or if you can't find it, you press the Alt-R key a couple of times until you find it. Then you see the list of all your chapter marks here. And you can simply click in the field and change the names, for example, and then you have it already also in your timeline and you see the chapter marks labeled here. Interestingly, if you have an edit marker that you'd set, for example, during the recording, then it shows also up in this list. What I personally do is during the recording, I very extensively use the edit marks to mark positions where I have to do something later on in the edit. And then I work through them one by one. And when I'm done with one, I delete it. And if I don't delete it, it's no problem. Even if it's in the list here, it won't be exported or used anywhere else. Nobody else can see them ever. Ultraschall will just skip over the red markers and it will only talk about the black chapter marks or think about them. Another cool thing that you can do with chapter marks is add images to them. And to show you that, I'm opening the marker dashboard in the bottom left of Ultraschall, and here you also see a list of your markers, and you can also change them and change the values here, same as you can do down here in the menu. And you can also do two other additional metadata things with these chapter marks, which I find really cool. And Ultraschall, I think, is one of the easiest way to do that. First, you can change the URL. You get this added chapter URL box, and then you can just copy and paste or type in any URL that you want to use. And then it shows up here in the list. And then in podcast clients that support this, and this is quite a lot by now, you can simply, in the chapter list, directly tab on the chapter and jump to the URL that's given there. So if you're talking about a certain website, about a paper, about whatever you want to link to, your listeners can simply press this and jump there straight ahead. You can also add images, and it's described here. Simply drag and drop an image into an empty track at the position. So if you click this, the playhead jumps to the position. I'm going to do this here at the second marker, and then I have an image prepared that I simply drag and drop onto an empty track. And then I already see the preview in the timeline and in my chapter dashboard or marker dashboard. And then this image will be displayed in the podcast client when this chapter is reached. So when you talk about something that's visual and you want your listeners to be able to see it very easily, you drop an image in here at the chapter mark, and then if you talk about a map, for example, you can drop that in there. Say, if you look at the map, you see the river down here, and then people can see the map in the cover art section of the podcast client. And this also works with most podcast clients. For example, the standard Apple podcast client supports this feature, plus many, many others more. And with this, you can create and edit your chapter markers. When you're done with that, you open up the marker dashboard and you simply click export. It will open the file of your project, the folder of your project. You simply click save, and it will It already exists here. I'm just going to replace it. And then you create a text file that contains all of this information as well. And depending on your publishing platform, you might need this text file to let the player know where the chapter marks are. But we're going to actually bake them into our file. And to do that, I already exported the audio file. I will go over the individual export functions later on. So for now, we don't have to do that. And we're going to open the next thing here, which is the podcast export assistant. And here in the assistant, you find a number of green and yellow and sometimes red lights. And with that, you can mark. You can go through this simply and do what the assistant tells you. Here, for example, it tells you have one edit marker left in there. It's not a big problem, but to have a cleaner setup, you can simply then go here and delete the marker, and then this will update in a while, and it will be giving you an okay. Great. If you want to change anything about the markers, you can also click here on Edit Chapters, and you go back to the marker dashboard from this menu. Then you have the ID3 metadata. I have it already filled out here, and here you can give it your episode title, the author of the podcast name, the year of the podcast, the category of the podcast, and also description. This is in German, but you can write anything in here. This episode is about, and then simply press OK, and you have that metadata. So, and I just cleaned this. So next up, you have the podcast episode image. You can simply drag and drop a file from your Finder or browser and drop that in here, and it will add that as the podcast image. And you can also add some as presets here, and then simply with the click of a button, select another podcast image. And finally, when this is done, you can click Finalize MP3. And it will give you a message that tells you if your MP3 is named like the project file, that it successfully updated the file. If you change the name during the export process, it will ask you where the file is, and you point it at an MP3 file, and then it will change that MP3 file. And with that, you have added rich metadata to your file. And it also works then that you can actually see it in your playback. So here I just opened the file in Quick Look, and you see all of the data that we added, the title, the name, the cover image, all of that is written into the MP3 file. And now if you publish it, it should be able to be read by all kinds of podcast publishers. With that, we're done for today. We added metadata to our podcast, and if you have any questions, just ask them down there in the comments. In the next episode, I will briefly talk about how to export your file and what special things you can do when you're exporting your file. And with that, thank you for watching, and goodbye.